The storm came down from the mountains like a living thing, howling through the pines and clawing at the lonely cabin perched on the edge of the New Mexico wilderness, and inside that cabin lived Eleanor Whitmore, a widow who had learned to survive silence better than people, because people had taken too much from her, her husband to fever, her child to a cruel winter, and her faith to the endless ache of waking up alone. Yet that night as thunder split the sky and rain turned the earth to mud, she heard something she hadn't heard in years, a cry, thin and terrified, barely louder than the wind, and though every instinct told her to stay inside, to bolt the door and let the world pass her by as it always did, something older and deeper pushed her into the storm with a lantern trembling in her hand, where she found him collapsed near the fence line, a boy no more than 8 or 9, Apache by his dark hair and sharp cheekbones, his clothes torn, his body shaking from cold and fear, his ankle bleeding badly, and for a long moment Eleanor froze, knowing the stories whispered in towns, knowing the danger, knowing what sheltering an Apache child could mean, but when the boy looked up at her with eyes wide and glassy and whispered a word she didn't understand, she saw not a warrior, not an enemy, but a child lost in a world that had never been kind, so she carried him inside, laid him by the fire, cleaned his wound, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him the last of her stew while the storm raged like judgment outside, and though he flinched at every sound and clutched a small carved bone charm as if it were his soul, he did not fight her, did not run, and when exhaustion finally claimed him, he slept with his hand curled into her sleeve as if afraid she might vanish too. All night Eleanor sat awake, listening to the rain ease and her conscience argue with her fear, because she knew Apache children did not wander alone. Not without reason, not without people who would come looking, and yet when dawn broke clean and cold and the boy woke with a start, reaching for the knife at his belt before realizing where he was, she spoke softly, offered him water, and through broken words and gestures learned his name was Taza, that his people had been attacked days earlier, scattered by soldiers, that he had run into the mountains and followed the storm until he could run no more, and when she told him he could stay until he healed, something in his guarded expression loosened, just a fraction, as if trust were a dangerous thing but hope was worse to lose. Eleanor expected fear to rule that morning, expected the silence outside to feel threatening, but nothing prepared her for what she saw when she stepped onto her porch at sunrise. Rows of figures emerging from the trees, silent, mounted, armed, their feathers and paint catching the early light, until the forest itself seemed to stand upright. And within minutes her cabin was surrounded by nearly 300 Apache warriors, horses snorting, bows drawn but not yet loosed, and at their center rode a tall man with silver threaded through his black hair, his gaze fixed on the cabin door, and Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it, yet she did not run, did not hide the boy, because when Taza saw them, his breath caught, and he whispered one word with relief so deep it broke her, "Father," and before Eleanor could stop him, he limped onto the porch, holding up the bone charm, calling out in Apache, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the silver-haired warrior dismounted and approached, his eyes scanning the cabin, the woman, the child, reading truths no words could hide, and when he reached Taza, he knelt, touching his son's face with hands that had known battle but trembled now. Then he looked up at Eleanor, and instead of rage, she saw something far more dangerous, judgment mixed with gratitude, and he spoke in halting English, saying he was Chief Nantan Lupan, that his son was the heart of his people, that many would have used the boy as bait or killed him out of fear, and Eleanor answered honestly, telling him she only did what any mother would do, and at that word, mother, something shifted among the warriors, because loss was a language they all spoke, and after a long silence, the chief raised his hand, signaling his warriors to lower their weapons, and the tension broke like ice under spring sun. Yet the danger did not pass, because soldiers would come. They always did, and sheltering an Apache child marked Eleanor as a traitor in the eyes of her own people, but that day the Apaches did not take her cabin, did not burn it or threaten her life. Instead they brought her gifts, dried meat, blankets, a new door carved by hand to replace the one the storm had broken, and before they left, Chief Nantan Lupon offered her protection, saying any harm that came to her would be answered by his people, and when the warriors disappeared back into the forest. As silently as they had come, Eleanor collapsed onto her porch steps, shaking not from fear, but from the realization that kindness had nearly cost her everything and yet somehow given her more than she had lost. Weeks later, when soldiers rode up demanding to know why Apaches avoided her land, why no raids touched her cabin, Eleanor said nothing of the boy, nothing of the chief, and when the soldiers left empty-handed, she noticed a familiar carved bone charm hanging on her doorframe, a silent promise, and from that day on, travelers found her cabin a place of strange peace, where storms never seemed as fierce and the forest felt watchful, protective, and years later, when Eleanor passed from the world quietly in her sleep, Apache warriors were seen standing among the trees as her cabin burned according to her wishes, smoke rising like a prayer, and in the end, her story was not written in books or told in towns, but carried in the hearts of those who understood that sometimes, one act of compassion can stop a war before it begins, and if this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage often whispers instead of shouts, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because these are the stories that deserve to be remembered, and every new subscriber helps keep them alive.